Over $1 billion. In 1997, that was the net loss for Apple Computer, the company that basically invented the personal computer. Now, this wasn't just a bad year. This was a free fall. So how does an icon of innovation get so close to total collapse? That's the question at the heart of our autopsy today.
And it wasn't just an internal problem. The market's verdict was brutal. This quote, pulled directly from their own 1997 annual report, says it all. Their debt was downgraded to non-investment grade. In plain English, that means junk. It's the financial world's way of saying a company is so risky it's on the verge of defaulting. The warning signs weren't just whispering, they were screaming.
So, that's the big question, right? How did the company behind the Macintosh, the very symbol of innovation, find itself staring into the abyss? Well, to figure out how they pulled off one of the greatest comebacks in business history, we first have to perform an autopsy on the failure. The goal here isn't to point fingers. It's to understand the core strategic diseases that brought the company to its knees.
All right, let's begin the autopsy of 1997 and start by examining the symptoms. Our key piece of evidence is the official record, Apple's own annual report from that year. You know, these documents are usually pretty dry, but this one reads like a medical chart for a patient in critical condition.
And right there in the report, two major symptoms jump out, and they're deeply connected. On one hand, you have total strategic chaos. A perfect example is them killing off their macOS clone program, a huge reversal. And what happens when strategy is in flux? You get the second symptom, a mass exodus of talent. The report calls it significant voluntary employee turnover, which is corporate speak for our best people are jumping ship.
And you just have to love the language here. This sentence is such a calm, clinical way of admitting to a catastrophic mistake. The whole idea behind the clone program was to get the macOS on more machines and grow market share. But what happened? It completely backfired. The clones ended up eating into Apple's own hardware sales, destroying their profits.
All this chaos, of course, led to a crisis at the very top. After the company announced its worst quarter ever, CEO Gil Amelio was out. He didn't even last 500 days. It was this leadership vacuum that opened the door for Steve Jobs to come back, first as an interim CEO. His job really was just to keep the ship from sinking.
Okay, so we've seen the symptoms. Huge financial losses, strategic confusion, people leaving in droves. But a good autopsy doesn't stop at the symptoms, it finds the disease. And for Apple, the diagnosis is a textbook case of what's known as the innovator's dilemma.
This concept from Professor Clayton Christensen is absolutely key to understanding what happened. It's this paradox where a successful company can actually fail because it does everything right. You know, they listen to their best customers, they keep making their products better and better, and then suddenly they get completely steamrolled by a cheaper, good enough alternative that they never saw coming. And here's exactly how that played out. On one side, you have Apple's approach, the integrated innovator. Think of it like a high-performance race car, where every single part is designed by one team to work perfectly together. It's amazing, but it's expensive. On the other side, you have the PC world's modular approach. This is more like building a car from off-the-shelf parts. It might not be as elegant, but it's way cheaper and more flexible. And for most people, that good enough performance was, well, good enough.
This quote from Ben Thompson just nails it. The very thing that was Apple's greatest strength, that total control over hardware and software, suddenly became its biggest weakness. The market changed. People started caring more about price and options than about having the absolute best performing machine. And this is so important to grasp. Apple wasn't failing because they were incompetent. They were failing because the game had changed and they were still playing by the old rules.
So, with that diagnosis in hand, it was time for the intervention. And when Steve Jobs came back, his first move wasn't about creating something new. It was about cutting things away. It was basically an act of emergency surgery.
The story is legendary. Jobs walked up to a whiteboard and drew this simple grid: consumer, pro, desktop, laptop. And he said, "This is the new Apple." He slashed the product line from dozens of confusing models down to just 4. Everything else was gone. It was absolutely brutal, but it was the kind of radical focus they desperately needed.
And that decision really embodies this famous quote from him. It's not just about what you decide to do. It's about all the other things you decide not to do. For Apple in 1997, focus wasn't just a good idea. It was the only thing that could save them.
Then came the next move, and this one was a real shocker: a deal with the enemy.
Microsoft invested $150 million in Apple. Now, the money was nice, sure, but that wasn't the real prize. The real win was getting Microsoft to publicly promise they'd keep making Office for the Mac. In one move, Jobs killed the story that the Mac was a dead platform.
Okay, so the patient was stabilized. Now it was time for the cure. The goal wasn't just to get back on their feet. It was to develop a whole new strategic DNA that would make them immune to this kind of disruption in the future.
And the first big test of this new approach was the iPod. See, the iPod wasn't just a cool new gadget. It was a playbook. It was a strategy built on 3 core ideas that were designed to flip the innovator's dilemma on its head.
First principle, the product isn't the device. It's the entire experience. Apple didn't just sell you a little white box. They sold you the whole system. The iTunes Store for buying music, the software for managing it, and the device for listening to it. That seamless end-to-end control was something no competitor who was just slapping together off-the-shelf parts could ever hope to match.
And the result? Well, the numbers speak for themselves. This wasn't just success. It was complete and total domination. The iPod captured a share of the market that was unheard of in consumer electronics. It was proof positive that owning the entire experience was the winning strategy. Now, this third principle is maybe the most important and the hardest to pull off: a willingness to disrupt yourself. Think about this. They launched the cheaper iPod mini knowing it would steal sales from the original. Then, they killed the mini while it was the best-selling player in the world to launch the even smaller Nano. And the ultimate act of self-disruption, releasing the iPhone, which Jobs himself called the best iPod we've ever made, knowing full well it would eventually make the iPod obsolete. They decided to make their own products obsolete before someone else did.
So, after this whole autopsy, what are the big takeaways? What are the universal principles we can learn from Apple's near-death experience?
You can really boil it down to a few key lessons that apply to any business. First, extreme focus is your most powerful weapon. Second, if you can own the entire user experience, you build a fortress no one can breach. Third, if you're falling behind, don't play catch-up. Change the game entirely. And finally, you have to obsessively protect the quality of your team to prevent what Jobs called the bozo explosion, where great people hire good people and good people hire mediocre people until the whole organization is mediocre.
And this isn't just a philosophy, it's baked into the very way Apple is structured. They're not organized around products like an iPhone division or a Mac division. They're organized around expertise, a software group, a hardware group, a design group. What this does is it forces everyone to collaborate and focus on one thing, making the best possible product, not just making their little division look good on a spreadsheet.
Which leaves us with a final and maybe uncomfortable question to ask ourselves. We talked about the bozo explosion. The tough truth is that it's often enabled by a culture of politeness, of not wanting to have the hard conversations. So the enduring lesson from Apple's brush with death is this: you have to have the discipline to ask the tough questions inside your own walls long before the market forces you to.